Hello and welcome to Conversations about Language Teaching. I'm your co-host, Dr. Reed Riggs, he, him,
And I am Dr. Diane Neubauer, she, her.
and we have a
Eh,
special guest today. Yeah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. My name is Dan Call. Pronouns are he, him.
Great.
Yeah. And
And
so this is kind of a foray for us into talking with a third person. We've had Non-Ta on the program a couple of times. And after getting to meet Dan at the ACTFL convention, which was mentioned in a recent episode, we were happy to be able to talk with him about something that he's interested in related to language teaching.
Yeah. Well, I think that so we decided that I'm leading this one. So it's going to be very unstructured by design, as all of our episodes are. Dan, you had asked what you could prepare, and all I gave you was just a general topic, and you said you wanted to prepare that. So I think that's enough introduction to jump in. It was about heritage, your expertise, your knowledge, your experience about heritage languages. I think the way this can go forward, just to put you at ease, is you share what you want to share, and I think we'll kind of get our minds turning, and we'll see where the conversation goes.
that sounds great. All right.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, like I should say, heritage is definitely a passion of mine. It's one of many passions I have in the classroom, but it's the one I think that is perhaps of most interest to a lot of other teachers because in the time since I started teaching Spanish, this is my 21st year. Uh, Everywhere that I've gone, everyone who I've had the chance to bring the topic up with, they've all told me that they have lots of questions. They've tried a lot of things, and they would love to see both resources as well as practices. And fortunately, I've been opening up my classroom for other teachers to come in and look at, observe, talk with for about a decade. And it's
Yeah.
something that really has, I guess, become, if anything, my cup of tea, I guess you could say. So I would start off by saying that I myself am a heritage speaker of Spanish. My mother immigrated to the United States in 1973 from Chile, the same month of the Pinochet regime coming to power. She and my father were married. He's from Idaho, and they were married, immigrated to the United States. And I grew up in a household hearing them speak Spanish to each other, although my mother was very dedicated to learning English because she was on a path to get her citizenship. Um, and I know that it pained her that she didn't spend more time directly teaching us in Spanish. But that said, we did acquire a lot, right? We had friends, we had family members that came to the house that lived with us. I vividly recall hearing my mother's Julio Iglesias tapes, Rafael, I mean, other crooners, that just maintain that connection to her family and her youth. A stack of magazines, comics, other things like that in Spanish. And so I grew up around Spanish, and I grew up hearing it. My parents sometimes used it as a sort of secret language. They would sometimes switch to
Mhm.
Jeringonza, which is the Spanish Pig Latin, I guess, is the equivalent. When they figured out that we were understanding and listening in on their conversations.
Yes, I have
Uh,
heard that before from heritage learners of a language that their parents did not necessarily realize right away how much the kids could understand, and the kids used that as much as they could, and then kind of got found out somewhere. And yeah,
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 yeah, it's definitely
it's
something that
very interesting, like how the way that works. That a
The
parent could not
motivations.
realize,
Yeah.
and well, and the motivational aspects of that too. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
do you want me to learn this language or not?
Yeah.
There was a little of that
yeah.
back and forth. Um, um, yeah, I did take Spanish in high school. I signed up for it as a class and realized really quickly that it was, although it was the only option that was available for me, right? I started high school in 1990, and it was the only option available for me. Our high school had first, second, and third year Spanish. And
Mm.
I should have been, I mean, by all rights, if there had been a heritage class, I would have been in that. My teacher was amazing and very knowledgeable, very friendly, but the class just wasn't equipped to address my needs.
Right.
But still, I plugged through 2 years.
So you
And
actually started
all
in
that,
Spanish one as a heritage speaker, or
No.
yeah,
I did.
Oh,
Yeah,
no.
I
yeah.
did well. My Spanish wasn't great, but I had I guess what we'd call, I had a lot of language capital that just remained
Yeah.
untapped, you know.
Yeah.
I remember bringing in like one of those comics that I mentioned. My mother had the stack of Condorito comics, which were, I mean, just kind of, lowbrow, kind of corny, the equivalent of maybe like Garfield comics in Spanish. But I would bring those in to share with my teacher, and she would read them and pass them back to me and say, "That's interesting." And at the whole time, uh, there was never, I guess, any knowledge about how to tap in to a student's funds of knowledge, how to activate that and use that. But that stuck with me, right?
Yeah.
Um, it wasn't until I was a volunteer in Chile after I graduated from high school that I really had the chance to immerse myself in the language and learn it intensively there, and then returned to college, and that's where I minored in Spanish, decided to become a Spanish teacher, but still didn't have the quite the knowledge. I began teaching in 2004, and there were heritage speakers who were placed in. I was teaching then the second, third, and fourth year classes at the high school where I was at, and just didn't have quite that knowledge, but sensed that there was something that needed to happen here, right? Especially when we started my third year to offer AP Spanish, and the majority of the students who enrolled in that were heritage speakers. There were 4 who weren't, but the other 14 were heritage speakers or native speakers that were in that class. And uh, I fortunately, like the administration said, pick out whatever textbook you want. Remember those days?
Good.
And I found one that I was drawn to automatically that I didn't know, I didn't have the language still, but this was written by Francisco X Alarcón. He was a Chicano educator who passed away several years ago, but he wrote this text called Mundo 21, 21st Century World. And it had 2 editions, one which was geared towards heritage speakers and one that was geared towards traditional learners. And that's where my eyes started to open about, okay, there's different needs. I need to really be thinking about how I approach these students, what's best for them, what their needs are. And over the next few years, then I began to that framework when I started teaching at Franklin Pierce High School, where I'm at now in 2010. That's where I started to advocate, we've got to have a separate class. They need this. I'd heard of it, didn't know anyone doing that, but they conceded that to me. And in 2012, I believe, we started our first cohort of Heritage Spanish.
Real
Yeah,
quick,
that's wonderful.
I'm sure your story continues. I want to catch this while it's relevant right now. Um, a question I've had in my mind while you've been talking is, are there current recommendations or some sort of best practices or even materials for combined heritage and traditional students, or is the best practice to get them separated?
In my mind, the best practice, yes, is to get them separated, just because the tendency of having a combined class is to center the traditional students and to view the heritage speakers as there to enrich or support or create an immersion environment that then the traditional speakers are expected to rise up to. And so it centers the traditional speakers. So I would
Yeah.
always prefer, if I were to get that chance, to have them, at least in those initial phases of education, separated. Now that does pose a problem, because I mentioned I am going to be doing dual education, right?
Yeah.
And those
And
students
dual
who are arriving at
language
our high school,
immersion?
yes,
By dual, you mean?
This is kindergarten, like lower levels?
we started in kindergarten, and yeah, they've
Yeah.
gone all the way
Okay.
through elementary, middle
Yeah.
school, and then ninth grade. They'll be arriving, and
Oh,
this is going to be
Wow.
blended.
right.
But at this stage, they've had so many experiences together, and there's an understanding of what's going on. So it will take, I think, a little bit of readjusting in my mind, just because I've never
Sure.
worked with a group of ninth graders that will be operating at this level, but I've seen how they work, and I won't have to worry about that kind of artificial separation that I've been doing since I've only gotten my hands on students who were starting their language journey in high school.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of a third thing, the dual language immersion experience. But if I can ask you a question about something you referenced, the term funds of knowledge, which I know of as part of a culturally responsive pedagogy or some culturally relevant pedagogy, that kind of thinking. I wonder if you could define what you're thinking of there. I suspect that you are thinking not merely of language, but also other factors of identity related to being a heritage learner and a heritage speaker. And what does that mean for you?
For sure. Yeah, I was familiar with it from my like master's program, but for me, I look at it as just the same way that we tend to view paper or I guess digital currency, right, as something that can be spent to gain access to services or to goods. Um, that because of an individual's cultural upbringing, there's other things that can be viewed also as currency, right? That students or their communities can activate and so, like for me, the best research that has come up recently, the twist on it is Tara Yosso's community cultural wealth, right? And I think of the
Oh, I don't know
example
that one.
of Yosso, very, very interesting spin on it because she looks at it specifically towards communities that are marginalized.
Mhm.
And she names six specific cultural capitals that can be spent. And so, for instance, one of them could be familial capital, right? That the family can lend support. So, for instance, when you have a student who is pulling an all-nighter or doing some homework that they need to complete, and you have the parents who chip into like, "Mijita, te voy a hacer un chocolate," right? They're going to make some coffee pot for you or support you
Mhm.
and make sure you've got a good space at home so you can do that. The language capital is the one that I'm most interested in, that I try to activate the most, which is just any form. Like a lot of public schools traditionally have only valued English as a language that is present at the school. How do we see that? Well, you walk into the building, and all of the signage, all of
Yep.
the forms are in English, right? But we can acknowledge, first of all, the existence of language capital by saying, well, what are the languages that are used at the school? And then make sure that we have maybe other adults who speak those languages so that it's accessible, the whole institution. There's we have institutional capital, navigational capital, sorry, like which is the ability to navigate through systems that were not necessarily created with marginalized communities in mind. So think of the hospital system, right?
Mhm.
And when you have a 14-year-old student who has to miss classes because they've got to go with their mother to help
Help.
interpret there, because the
Right.
hospital doesn't have anything. Well, that student is using navigational capital, building navigational capital, applying their language capital. And so, like, really, as my uh, awareness of these different capitals have grown, not just theoretically, but in practice of talking with my students about what their lives are like and helping them to recognize, oh, that's a form of capital. I've been
Yeah.
more and more in my education about trying to activate those, become aware of them, help students become aware of them, and then try to find ways to value those in class so that they can see,
Yeah.
okay, this has got applicability to do more than just what I've been doing because I have to. I can turn this into a career. I can
Right.
refine it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's tremendous. Yeah, I think of that. This is an aside, but I'm planning an event for the university that I work for. And what you just said is kind of one of the things that we want to help develop in this. It'll be like a multilingual learners educational simulation where we're going hopefully to help primarily English speakers, monolingual English speakers who want to be educators to understand that those are real skills that people come in with, that they are to be respected, developed, appreciated, not taken advantage of per se, but like to recognize that these children who are multilingual are doing this kind of navigational work all the time between family and home and school, and being able to do that is a tremendous amount of work, potentially. So, um, you mentioned a name there. Was it Terry Osso? Can you spell that for me? Because we'll put that in the show
Yeah,
notes.
Yosso. And
Y-O-S.
the paper that she published is called Community Cultural Wealth.
Okay, I'm typing that in so I remember it. Thanks.
Yeah,
Dan, you have me
you bet.
wondering, so, signage on the topic of signage around the school being all English, um, I'm wondering if more generally, have you read about or do you have thoughts about getting the school more aware of the linguistic capital and the cultural capital that students bring in. Like it's not just to keep it private in the classroom, but to somehow, I don't want to say like announce or like, not in a flashy way, but just in a
Mhm.
sort of inclusive way to kind of change the linguistic landscape, the signage or something around campus to help make that feel less
Yes.
ostracizing.
Actually, yes. And fortunately, I'm not alone with this in our district. We have an amazing coordinator for our dual program district wide, Maria de Jesus Sebastián Penador. And she is a nationally recognized dual language instructor who came to us she's Spanish, but she made her name in Texas a few years ago and has been in our district now for about 7 or 8 years, and she's doing a lot of that kind of work. Like I've been to the elementary school where morning announcements are read in both English and Spanish.
Mhm.
You walk into the library and the signage, the posters, the books, they reflect that. They have a parent community group that comes in and advises, here's what we need, here's what we're hearing, here's what's of interest to us. A project that I'm working on right now, actually, for my students to begin. I have two sections of Heritage Spanish, and I want them to feel that they are sort of, I guess, to use a pregnancy term, like that they're nesting our school in preparation for the arrival of our dual kids. So what I've got cooking on my stovetop, so to speak, is a project where I'm going to have the students evaluate the signage around our school in different spots. Our school is built California style with like different buildings that are separated, so they have
Yeah.
to walk between buildings. And so each group of students is going to have one of these buildings, and they're just going to evaluate the signage, other things like that around the school. I'm creating a rubric using uh, some papers that were published by Ofelia Garcia, who is our wonderful translanguaging expert. A lot of input that's been valuable for dual programs. But anyhow, I want my students to feel that they themselves are the ones who are evaluating the school. Like, how well would your abuela be able to figure out, what's going on if she were to come to the school? And I
Yeah.
want the students to make recommendations for what they could do to improve. And then we're going to collaborate. This is going to be interdepartmental, but we have an aerospace engineering class that has access to a very high quality 3D printer. And they've offered already to print up some official signage that we could then get hung around the school to improve things. And so
Cool.
that's something that I'm looking forward to a lot. Yeah.
That's
Yeah, that's
incredible. Yeah.
tremendous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. Um, Coming back to practices, classroom practices, what would you say are some just major needs for heritage learners and for teachers to be either trained in or at least to have on their radar to get trained in, to start thinking
Yeah.
about what do heritage learners need?
You've got to, like, in a traditional first, second, third year type track, we're focusing on and using the actual rubrics for evaluating language, right? With heritage students, you got to think of it differently. It's like the language skills and those rubrics are valuable to a point, but you also, I've heard it said that you want to think of it as braiding with two other strands. So in addition to the language, you've got to have like a cultural piece where you're exploring and talking about and unpacking what it means to be part of the Spanish speaking community, right? However you define that. And I know that I tend to fall on and favor the word Latine, right? Latinx as sometimes gets used. And I don't have any animosity or anger towards people who favor other things. I know that Chicano is a big one, Chicanx. We definitely hear a lot. But whatever you define that as, I love to teach students to like explore all aspects, all the labels, to try and explore what it means to be that here in the United States, but then also to make sure that they have opportunities to connect with folks in other countries. I have a cousin, fortunately, who is a teacher in Arica, Chile, and we've managed to collaborate a little bit with their classes, and the students love
Cool.
that. The
Yeah.
other strand that you want to try and weave into, and so there's the social emotional part of it. that is unique. And that belongs, of course, in a traditional classroom as well. But I think that there's a lot more to unpack because we have a lot more common experiences. Like students will walk in to my class and I can spot right away which ones need to hear about imposter syndrome, right? Who have been called out for not and
I have
which
heard
ones
that
maybe.
from Spanish teacher friends at a school where I used to work, where they would have heritage learners and they come in with such a wide range of linguistic backgrounds, but sometimes the total beginner kind of students would look at them and say, your last name's Rodriguez. I perceive you as a Spanish speaker by racial stereotyping or something like that. And then that student would not want to open their mouths because they were not necessarily extremely proficient in the language. And like, I think seeing that as you still come in with assets, and seeing yourself as a person who can speak into this area, like you count as a Spanish speaker or a member of this heritage language community. I think it's important, but challenging.
Absolutely.
I mean, I feel like I teach Chinese and I've only had a few heritage speakers, but it definitely touched on this issue quickly. And there were issues too with family and parents and their expectations for that child too. So I glad that you brought that up because I feel like that's something that it's not just like an add-on. That's a core part of it. So it's interesting that you described it like three strands, like the social
Yeah.
emotional side of things. Yeah.
It really, and of course, the glue that holds it all together is that it's done through the language as much as possible.
Right.
But imagine in a first year class, if you were to be doing it that way, that you had students that were starting at novice low and then intermediate low and intermediate mid in that class, right? What that would do.
Right.
But that's the reality of a heritage class
Okay.
oftentimes, because we will have some students that are still like, I don't want to say in the silent mode, but it's a sort of social imposed silent stage, where they themselves don't feel super comfortable. Maybe they've heard from their parents. I have students that tell me that they've been told you're ruining the language, you can't speak it, and it's coming from families sometimes. And so, like, I try to do whatever I can to lower their filters, to help them feel a sense of connection throughout the year. And it's tricky because there are going to be those students who are already at intermediate, high, or advanced, levels because of their own unique experiences. And how do we help them to come into conversation with a student who's barely coming in at the intermediate levels, but who wants desperately to be in that class? And there are some students who I have found that have been at like about intermediate mid, but who don't want to be in a heritage class because they're so shy about using the language. And they feel, I mean, it's rough because I really try to encourage them. But if at the end of the day, they insist, I want to be in second year or first year, and I respect that. We put them in there and we try to help them as best as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The differentiation piece, it sounds like it's a sort of a new avenue you're exploring. What have been some successful things that you've tried and found worked?
Well, mainly, I found that I have to like do more than just input grades. I'll keep a spreadsheet with students of some specific things that I notice from their writing samples or their speaking samples. We get those early on in the year, and I'll just make some observations. Like the student is using simple phrases, simple sentences, or in the writing samples. I'm noticing. I mean, with heritage students, you tend to notice some writing patterns that are happening because they've heard the language all their life and nobody has really shown it to them in writing. And so we try not to, I have to constantly check myself and make sure that I'm not applying a deficit lens towards the students. That's incredibly important. It's easy to do. And I've sat in some classes with other teachers of heritage that clearly are clinging to a deficit mindset. Here's what they can't do. Here's what they don't know. So I have to make sure that I'm not doing that. But then I notice patterns. And I think that is a fairly neutral thing to do. And then the next question just becomes, so what's the next thing that student needs? And in some cases, I can follow up by making specific focus groups for them to practice. Oftentimes, we'll do it as a whole class. So for instance, a common writing issue that a lot of heritage students will come up with is the um, words that are written with the letter H, which in Spanish is silent, right? Uh, and I'll tell my students, not that they're ruining the language or they don't know how to speak it, but that I'm hoping that we can help you to use your language in a professional or an academic setting so that you can plan on getting access to more power, more prestige, more money, right? You should be able to do that stuff. And so the next step, once I've got some buy-in from them, is to maybe call attention to a specific issue that we're noticing. So, all right, these words are usually written with an H at the front, but notice in your writing samples here, we're seeing this, and I'll put some up on the board that are general so that they won't feel called out. And then we can do something like, a really great activity has been to do the dictado, the dictation type relay activities. So we have them in 5 groups, right, of 4 people each. And I've got 4 sentences up here that ChatGPT has helped me to generate some sentences on a topic that use words that will start with the letter H in there. And the students will come up, they read it from my desk, they go back to their group, dictate it to the group. So there's reading, they're speaking.
Okay.
The students sitting down are listening, and they write it out, and they know what to be watching for, but it's still input about some other topic that we've been doing. So, like the last one
I've
of
heard
those
that.
that I did was. Mhm.
Oh, I've heard that called running dictation. So if somebody was
Yeah,
looking for that activity,
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
done that too.
run dictation or yeah, dictation relay. We did one just recently on the topic of a Venezuelan. Like I wanted my students to compare the Dia de Guadalupe, La Virgen de Guadalupe, which is a major celebration for Mexican students, for Mexicans. I wanted them to compare that with San Benito, which is a religious celebration from Venezuela, and just get them noticing some similarities and some differences in there. And so they were focused mostly on the cultural parts of it, and while they were at the same time getting a little bit of language input on the form. And
Yeah,
it turned out to be a success.
So the
cool.
dictation was gradually coming together to have this information about the similarities and differences between these two celebrations, but it was sort of piecemeal coming together with children running from the text to the writers, and then the writers were kind of
Exactly.
piecing it together. Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to
Yeah,
see
very
because it
cool.
can take the whole, I'll tell them memorize the whole thing and take it back to your group, or just memorize a little chunk and take it back to your
Hmm.
group. And so it
Nice.
lowers their affective filter some more. So those students who are still feeling really worried, they'll do it a word at a time and then go
Yep.
back
Yeah. Oh,
eventually
that's nice. Yeah, when I've done
more and
that
more.
before, I've always told them like they had to learn the sentence and like, it is this kind of immediate memorization thing. So I would often call back on some kind of rewritten text that they had seen in class. So something in Chinese, reading issues are a little different when you're looking for characters. And this high pressure time crunch feel to it. But I like that, like giving them the option of, retain as much as you can, go back and bring it to your group, and you're going to piece it all together as a team. I think it encourages the team cooperative feel maybe more than like, you didn't get the sentence right again, go back, and rather than a feeling of like
There's
disappointment with a team
choice.
member. So I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I love
There,
that.
the
It's
active
that.
part of,
Go ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to say, just
It's
one more
often
part.
something that's sorry, we're talking over each other. I'll stop.
Okay, I was going to say it's one more part of cultural capital because we often hear that as opposed to the more individualistic groups, since our Latinx students tend to be more communal, right? And this is something that's very collaborative in a group, and you'll
Yeah.
see students taking risks and supporting each other a lot more than in other activities, which are much more atomistic. So.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that atomistic thinking in terms of language. I mean, that's something that a lot of teachers would typically or easily default to treating as just here's forms, memorize these, get these pronunciations clear enough to communicate discrete sentences. I love that you keep it together as, it's all coming together into something holistic that it gives it purpose because there's learning about culture. Um,
Right.
so I feel like, do you think that things that are discovered that are kind of necessary and helpful and beneficial and motivating to heritage learners would also be just as good in traditional teaching?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the SEL aspect of examining your own experiences and feelings with language are definitely translatable. A lot of the activities that we have done, like it goes both ways too. Like I still find the importance of a lot of movement play, that there is an affective filter at work also with our heritage students, even if they are quite advanced, because it's maybe a little bit more for our heritage students. It has maybe a little less to do with language acquisition and more to do with social coherence with the group.
Yeah.
And so it's always valuable, whatever you can do to build a sense of community. I will acknowledge too that my desire to explore identity in the heritage class is just as interesting to our first and second year level students that want to know about. Like I, for instance, have done a lot of unpacking with this idea of the mestizo learner, right? The mixed race learner, since that represents myself, and I've had a journey of understanding the indigenous side of me, which has tended to be absorbed into the mestizo raza aspect of things. Like I want to not necessarily disentangle it, but I've wanted to explore my Aymara roots. My ancestors are of the Aymara nation of Andino, the Andes Mountains. And I've done a lot to try and explore that and talk about that with the students and then encourage them to do the same in the heritage classes. Well, that's led to so many discoveries and wealth of knowledge that we're able to then share with first and second year classes as well. Whether it's, I think of, for instance, a lot of the work that has been done with textiles. We've been gathering different textile patterns, which I mean is indigenous, but it also is very feminist, since it's a womanized kind of way of technology, which has often been relegated and marginalized, which actually contains so much information, so many skills and identity in there. And I've been able to do some work with unpacking that with my students. Right, a traditional first year class will have something talking about clothing. But why not, instead of just making it a list or looking at things that you can get online, why not also talk about the clothing of different indigenous peoples that they've contributed and that still get used to?
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that are you saying that materials that are created by the heritage learners in the heritage class can then be used as, something akin to, if not exactly the same as authentic materials with the traditional students? That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, absolutely. You can do that. You go through a process that involves editing, that involves maybe a little bit of feedback, and then you can convert that easily into a gallery walk. Like my students, I'm thinking of the example. I had students last year try to uh, do a little bit of research into an indigenous group from their own parents' homelands, right? And so students whose parents were coming from Michoacan in Mexico, or one from Petén in Guatemala, and so forth. They each created a little one pager. My heritage students created a one pager that had the document. I was thinking of the products, practices, and perspectives, right? So the students had to uncover at least two products, one practice of an indigenous group, and try to infer a perspective that was contained in those, and then put it in a one pager. And then my heritage students posted those around our hallway up and down. And we had our first year students do a gallery walk where they had to match the product with the cultural group. And so
That's
it
great.
makes for a nice interchange there.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like those kinds of like cross any levels that you're teaching or any other sections you're teaching, when you can find ways to connect them, I feel like there's a draw in to like both the language learning and a sense of like, I want to keep being in this class, honestly, that like, because they know that it matters, like what that group did mattered for my class. And so when we do this thing, that class might see it. And it's something that feels a little, I think, more purposeful than just like we're doing this thing for
The
our
grade.
class to fill the time and to get this grade and stuff. And
Right.
Can I
make
share
it feel
one
real.
more example that I was really proud of?
Please.
Yeah.
Also, we had, when we were looking together last year at gender roles throughout Latin America, And I managed to like uncover a little bit more about there's a group from Bolivia called Cholitas Escaladoras, the climbing Cholitas.
Yeah, I've heard of
And
this.
it was a group of women who, in their traditional clothing, they have been leading expeditions of mountain climbers, but they kind of turned it into a thing where they're doing it to raise awareness of gender issues. I took a risk and reached out to one of them on social media, and we arranged for a live Zoom call with the heritage
Wow.
classes.
Yeah.
And did a question formulation technique where they prepared certain questions they wanted to ask her. We recorded it, and then we worked some of the conversation, some of the clips from our Zoom call into a first year class that was looking at pastimes, sports, things of that sort. And so they managed to hear and they were challenged to decode some of the responses that she had into sharing as to what she gets out of her
Yeah.
experiences doing this class. It was a very rewarding experience. A lot
Yeah,
of
that's
excitement,
huge.
and some students even in the class were saying, "Can we come in for the Zoom? We just want to be there and hear
Yeah.
what you have to say."
Yeah, that's very cool.
Do you find that the buy-in, this is probably just as true in traditional classes, but that the buy-in is something that has to be kind of fostered and maintained, and it can't just be like a one-off, like it's because one activity was good that students buy in, but it has you have to be consistently making things feel purposeful and relevant and personal to the students that and that it could be easy to mess up if you did something kind of contrived once.
I'm so glad you asked about that. Yeah,
Mhm.
I yes, it has to be something that is reflected on regularly. Um, to outsiders, they assume that because of the shared identity that we have buy-in automatically, and it's not the case. I have to make sure that I don't get too lofty with my academic goals and lose sight of what's happening in our community. I have one day earlier this year where students showed up to class and they were looking at their phones, which are supposed to not be used during class time, but they were looking at their phones because there were reports of ICE agents who were parked somewhere within our district.
Yeah.
And I had to address that. You know, we've talked about. I almost never have to talk about it with other classes, but I have had to give students like little
Yeah.
cards that we'd look at and say like, "What are your rights here?" And so that absolutely matters. Our community, in some cases, has been affected also by certain like announcements of different trailer parks that are very heavily populated by some of my students that were going to be undergoing construction or how they would be affected by new, I guess, just community activity coming into this area. Um, and then, I mean, just on top of that all, there's just the fact that some students uh, don't see it as important to connect with ethnicity or language and feel that they were perhaps forced into the class against their will. And I really take it not personally, but I do take it on myself that there's got to be something I can do to reach them or make them feel heard in this class. And it doesn't have to be all the time about identity and language. We want to try to use the language as much as possible, but I need to try to find ways to connect with every student so that they do feel and so that everyone can see there's a whole diversity of perspectives about what it means to be a heritage speaker.
Yeah, sure.
That touches on something that I've heard teachers say, which is, oh, I always get, students in my class that just they chose this language because they think they can just coast, and so that's why they chose it.
Mm.
Do you ever hear that, and do you have a good response to that?
Yeah, the students will hear that from us. Like, why are you taking Spanish, man? You already speak it. And of course, I mean, the easiest one is, well, you're taking an English class and you already speak English, right? And
True.
but I do tell them, I mean, okay, we're trying to take you to new places. Like your language is only what you've used it for, and likely, you've used it for these things. Let's talk about ways and places that you've used your language right now. And I'll put out sometimes a whole menu of different contexts. Like you use it at home, you use it to talk with family members. Do you use it to give presentations? Do you use it to publish anything online? And some, people will say, yeah, but maybe they've dropped off a little bit. Do you use it to prepare like a discourse or a lesson for your church group? Do you use it in all these different ways? so the students can see that, okay, they have used their language here, but here's where I haven't. Would you like to do that? How can we help you to make sure that you've got the right skills to do it successfully? And so then we get into talking a little bit about registers, about maybe codes of power. Who was it that? Sorry, it's one of our matriarchs of equity in education who gave me that terminology, codes of power. I'm not recalling her name right now.
Well, you know what we can do is
But
Google, yeah,
Yeah,
Google, and then we'll put it in show notes. We could just do that
right.
after. Yeah,
That's our usual solution.
that's what
So
we do.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
but yeah, like I will encourage students, if after one semester of this class you think you're ready to take, if you haven't already taken the language competency test, right, for language credits, because we do offer a seal of education, a seal of
oh, you
biliteracy.
said literacy. Mm-hmm.
Mm,
Cool.
yeah.
And I will encourage them. You need to take that, and if you feel that you've gotten what you need from this class and switch to another one, great. But look at the other offerings that we have. We've got AP Spanish after this. I now teach a culture and history of Latin America in Spanish for a social studies credit. With
Cool.
the coming dual program, we're going to have offerings in CTE, as well as we're working towards a certification program in translation and interpretation for both legal and
Wonderful.
medical.
Yeah.
They can get going by the
Yeah.
time they're.
Yeah.
So we
And
want
you
to,
said CTE. What did that stand
yes,
for?
career education.
Okay, there you go. Cool.
So we already have classes like in digital photography, video editing, business, and we have a few teachers who are just tightening up on their Spanish so they can teach some of those classes in Spanish for our dual kids, and hopefully open it up
Nice.
to.
Very cool.
Do you see students develop a kind of so you know when I visit the Spanish classes at my school, I see a lot of like American English flavored Spanish. And to me, I think of it as kind of an identity thing where it's American kids, American, mostly white kids saying, I'm not going to pretend that I'm from there. I'm just going to talk my normal kind of American with like, oh, yo hablo español. Like
Mm.
the teachers will get critical and say like, that's, you know, not, they'll try to model it. And the kids just seem really resistant. But then I was wondering if it goes the other way, if you've seen this with the heritage classes, is that they'll kind of develop a style that's like within their own classroom community, or is there some resistance to talking like people of another community?
Mm. Trying to see too, like, so okay, the first thing that comes to mind, I want to make sure if this is what you're thinking of, like a sort of a Spanish slash mock English that I hear from a lot of our community is Asian, since there's a lot of words like um, communication, right?
Okay. Oh
Or
yeah, yeah. Right.
I do hear a lot of Spanish speakers add Asian to the end of Spanish words as their way of doing a mock English, right?
Okay.
So
Oh,
Okay.
instead of
interesting.
libro, you would hear liberation, and
Right.
it's their way of doing things that, again, I don't know what to make of it. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking
Yeah.
about a power dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ability to do that at all is something of a flex, I guess
Right.
you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do. Is that what you were getting at with your question? Like, do we
I
have?
think I was thinking of two scenarios, and one is to a different group. So in one is when it's the English native speakers keeping their kind of English pronunciation when they go into a traditional
Yeah.
Spanish class,
Or
Yeah.
resisting really
resisting
trying out the new way to pronounce something in a
how
native
the
like way. Like I've seen that in Chinese
yeah
classes sometimes too, where it's not a matter of like, oh, pronunciation develops over time. Yes. It's actually a, one student in the class or two or like this, or occasionally they would tease me with it. I had students that like to say like refused to say lan. They said lan, but they did it to
land
me
yeah
like they did it to my face because they wanted to tease me and they knew better and it was a joke for them, but that it wasn't general. But occasionally I've had a student really resist feeling that new pronunciation system, I think. And I think it has been in the case of one student in particular. I think it was an identity kind of issue related to that doesn't sound like me. I can't sound like that and still feel okay about myself.
Yeah, yeah. I think when that is happening in those classes, for me at least, I do experience that with my first second year students. And I think that um, I know there's a psychological term for it, but it's a sense of like intentionally failing so that it kind of defangs
Okay,
the
sure.
pain of an actual failure. Like you're anticipating, and so you intentionally self-sabotage as a
Right.
way of defanging the embarrassment or the social
Okay.
awkwardness of getting it wrong anyways.
I accept that.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, that can
yeah,
be.
yeah. And in my heritage classes, I haven't picked up on that sort of thing happening.
Okay.
Um, yeah, what I see happening a lot more, again, I've had to retrain myself on, but that is something that happens a lot more in heritage classes is this issue of translanguaging, which is just how we speak, right?
Yeah.
It's just the way that we speak and that we have because we are living in a world where we swim constantly back and forth between different audiences. And my students do that. And I have had to, this goes back to the deficit approach that I sometimes easily fall back into of like with a traditional class, we are encouraging as much as possible students to use the target language, right? And at the same time, how do we do that without devaluing their full language repertoire? But in a heritage class, it matters much more because you're not just, I think of the trees that I see in my community since I'm in Washington, we've got them all over the place. And the trees that grow side by side, but the branches are all intermingled and the roots underground are super intermingled. It would be easier to keep them separate if you had like a fully grown tree over here and then a new one that you're planting in. But with our heritage kids, we're often talking about two fully grown trees. And
Yeah.
to artificially try to separate them
To,
is, I mean, it's
Yeah.
not my place to do that. And
Do you
so I
do you
have to
see the
find,
Yeah. Do you see the kids take on new styles through being in the class, like new
oh, yeah.
manners of speaking? Or oh, you do. That's really what I've been getting at the last couple minutes is my curiosity is
okay.
like through the heritage class, do you see them maybe talk how some of their classmates might talk, or talk how the teacher talks, or talk how some of the exposure to media they're watching? Does that through the
Mhm.
time in class you see their pronunciation, their style of speaking change?
That I have picked up on. Like I will sometimes intentionally introduce to them some slang. And so one that they've heard me say at least 500, 600 times since the beginning of the year, the Chilean slang for "Do you get it? Do you understand?" Right? In Spanish, it's generally "Me comprendes" or "Me entiendes," but in Chile they say "cachai," which both uses the word like catch from English, but they've modified it, and then the I at the end is a conjugation pattern that's unique to Chile. So I'll just check with them constantly if they understand me. Cachai? Yeah, and I hear them check with each other. They're re-explaining things.
Okay.
Cachai? Si, cacho.
Okay.
Uh, there's that. I've heard some students using che, the Argentine dude, I guess if you will. It's just a catch-all for everyone there.
Cool.
Um, I have like there's a game. I don't know if you remember the old board game Balderdash,
Yeah.
in which students are trying like to play the game in any language. You're basically mimicking a dictionary register, which is very academic. And when we have played Balderdash in class, I've noticed that students will sometimes imitate that register just in speaking. They'll get a little hoity-toity in their posture, and they'll sound a little bit like one of the AP recordings that you hear, the test, but they'll
Nice.
talk to each other that way, and it's a little bit mocking, and they'll
Yeah.
do it. I don't think they do it at me, but they are doing it playfully because they've heard it so much in class, and it sounds a little bit odd to them, and so it's their way of, I think, approaching it and playing with it the way that any child or
Right. Right.
even any kid would play with it to see how safe it is and if it's
Yeah,
something that's going to get a reaction, and it's fun.
Do the reaction.
for
And it's
sure.
it's
For sure.
initiated by them. You didn't tell them
Yeah.
to do this.
Oh yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah. When it's initiated by them, we'll sometimes set up a role play situation. In some cases, they're going to present it to the whole class, or in some cases, just to a small group, and they'll do it to I think just to see what they can get away with, and it often
Right.
evokes a
Yeah.
good reaction. So if they're
Yeah.
making
It's
fun
like
of me,
trying on
actually,
the other register of language use or the other, even sometimes maybe accent or word choice and all that is just, yeah. I know what you mean by that playful kind of thing. It's cool.
Very cool.
Yeah. I have another question that might be you can decide how much you want to even say about it, because one of the questions I have is just heritage learners of other languages. In the US, the majority of our heritage language speakers are probably Spanish speakers in most school districts. Um, what happens to the child who comes in and is a Lingala speaker at home, and is in the Spanish classroom? Does that, like that kind of situation, or students who have a less commonly represented language background? Do you have thoughts about how teachers can see that fund of knowledge as an asset as well, or how they might draw on that?
Mm. Uh, I mean, to draw it back to how I guess I've approached, right? Spanish is a tool in the colonizer's kit, as well as English, right?
Yeah.
And I would believe that any of the major languages that we teach have some history of oppressing or marginalizing other groups, other ethnicities within their lands, their traditional or their colonial lands. Uh, and so I think that although that's a terrible stain on our history, we have to look at that as ways in which marginalized people have not just bowed out and said, okay, I guess this is new language. They've challenged and they have uh, they've they have uh, inflected, or no, they what's the right word I'm looking for here? They've flavored languages with their own words, with their approaches, with their cultures, traditions. And I think that the notion of languages as corresponding to nationalities is, of course, it's a construct. And so part of the educator's job, the language educator's job for justice for these marginalized groups that are underrepresented, is to like find ways to take stock of those students in class and then look at how the language is connected to their community, even if it's not an obvious connection. Find ways that it is connected to that, and possibly find ways that those marginalized groups have pushed back and influenced, right? And so with my Spanish classes, the words that end with ote or ate in Spanish are usually from Nahuatl, one of the traditional languages from Mesoamerica, right? And so, and they're not few. I mean, they're words that have even come into English. So coyote, right?
Mm.
Tomato, aguacate for avocado, and the list just goes on and on. And we try to help them see like these are not Spanish words; these are Nahuatl words that the Spanish adopted because they gave them the invention. Let's look at other inventions, other things that came from this, and how language is not so discrete as we'd like to think it is. It's contested, right? That's one of the wonderful things about language is that it's not something that is completely done. It's something that we are constantly rewriting, and you've got the ability to do that. So, it goes to, I think, of course, what we could say about the wonderful activity we've seen with challenging the gender restrictions in Spanish languages and the use of gender neutral. I didn't know how to approach that at first, and it's only because people spoke up and gave me examples and modeled and failed, I would say in some cases, that I came to eventually adopt something which I feel is a lot more inclusive now.
Mm-hmm.
You want to say a little about that?
Just that I like when, well, sure. I'll try not to be too general, I guess, but like in my case, we've talked about how in English, you're seeing Latinx, right, Chicanx, but a lot of our Spanish-speaking populations reject that and don't really like that so much. Not everyone, but they prefer the gender neutral E as opposed to an O or an A at the end of a lot of words. Because we already have that. There are numerous words like inteligente for intelligent, which is an adjective that has that neutral form. And when I have, you can't really see it super well, but I mean, over here, you can sort of see I've got my vocabulary map. And even in the back of the room, my students have these are former vocabulary maps that I've got hanging up on the wall where when the students generate a word and they will add it and say like, we want to remember this one. And so I'll put it on there and then we hang it on the wall eventually. And we will include the gender neutral form in there, but we have those discussions. And does it lead to some confusion? Yes, but not doing anything also leads to some confusion. And it also leads to the implicit message that there's only, two possibilities here as opposed to a diversity of possibilities. It sometimes leads to some hard conversations about, why we do it this way or why I choose to do it that way. But in general, there's not nearly as much pushback as there is gratitude for the ability to do that.
It's wonderful. I think now would be a good time. I don't want to push our audience too far with the time. I think that we like
This
the
has been
shorter
such an
format.
interesting conversation. And
Yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah,
it's
I really
been
appreciate the depth of the thinking that you've done around these things, as well as the depth of the years of experience exploring things. And just to loop back to something you said towards the beginning about bringing other teachers into your classroom to observe and talk through ideas. And I love that as professional development. So I'm really encouraged that you're doing that kind of thing too. So, and did we say Dan was the finalist for the Pacific Northwest region of ACTFL in 2025? Did I get all the details there correctly? Pacific
Yeah, the
Northwest
Pacific
is
Northwest
the right term there. Yeah.
25. That was
Yeah. So
the
congratulations on that honor. And clearly well deserved for what you're talking about, you're
absolutely,
doing
yeah.
on a regular basis. So yeah.
This is great
and
information. Like I personally learned a lot during this
Yeah.
last hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
thank you so much,
Yeah.
Reed. And I'm going to continue listening to the podcast. Thank you for tuning
Oh,
me into the work you all are doing here. I mean, these kinds of conversations we need to have happening. So
Yeah.
I appreciate what you're
I
doing.
hope so. Yeah,
Thank
it is
you.
the
Yeah.
format it is because of our limitations on time and life.
Yes.
That if I had to prepare something, there just wouldn't be a podcast. So it's the
Yeah.
conversation. We figure out show notes afterwards. It is what it is, so that we can
Right.
make it happen. But I find that every time it drops every week, I go and listen to it, and I think that contributed. I think something new.
Mhm.
We've been tapped in for the last 10 or so years to language teaching, and we always have thoughts, and so it's great to have had you here to add to that.
Yep, for sure.
I'll say to you both gracias and yuspara, which is Aymara for thank you. And
Thank you.
Mhm.
it's been wonderful to be here.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you,
you, Dan
Cecilia,
Call.
for joining
Yeah,
us today.
Sis, yeah. Okay. Well, I've been Reed Riggs. Thank you for listening.
And I'm Diane Neubauer. We'll see you next time.